Welcome back to the Fortunate Fishes podcast. Avi Loeb is Harvard's former chair of astronomy and the guy that walked out of the ivory tower, looked up and said, there might not just be rocks. He's the best-selling author of Extraterrestrial and Interstellar, a scientist with credentials that Madison Avenue would kill for, and the habit of picking public fights with NASA anyways. If you like your science with data, doubt, and a little heresy, you're about to meet your favorite new troublemaker. Tell me, what was life after being on Joe Rogan? Like, what was that experience like? How did you prepare, and what did it do for you after that?
Well, this was my second time. I didn't prepare much, and the following day I was invited to a NASCAR car race in Bakersfield, California, where one of the racers decided to put my image on the hood of his car. Along with 3I Atlas, the interstellar object that that was the focus of discussion in recent months. So I told the racer that it's a great compliment for me to be on the hood of his car, but not for 3I Atlas, because that interstellar object, is moving 600 times faster than the fastest speed that his car can take. And then I was also wondering when I watched first he brought me into the car, showed me how to drive it, and he wants me to go there and compete in Daytona very soon. And my wife put a veto on that. She's not willing to take that risk. But I was wondering when I watched the race, why isn't there a company that invests in a self-driving car that would win the race? I mean, that's obviously feasible because you can use AI to do better than a human. But I realized that it's a sport, so we enjoy watching humans compete, and for the same reason, we don't have a robot taking out all the athletes in the Olympics, because we just want to see the best that a human can do. I mean, we know that a computer can win in a chess game, and nevertheless, people play chess. And for that reason, I'm optimistic about the future regarding artificial intelligence, AI, because I don't think that the AI generated art would be more valuable than human generated art, for that same reason that we enjoy looking at art as a means of communication among humans. And so I'm optimistic that there would be room left for creative individuals in the future. And I'm not shedding a tear on the loss of administration, bureaucracy. All these jobs that can be done by AI should be done by AI. We can save a lot of money. I'm currently at Harvard University, where I would very much hope that we can save money by having less bureaucracy. And with respect to AI, I'm really worried about the future, because just over the past 2 weeks,
I've seen a lot of deep fakes on you on that AI is created now all over YouTube, and you're
right?
saying all
Yeah,
these
exactly.
things like what?
I have 4 to 10 interviews every day, and there are more than 5 million people reading my daily essays on medium.com per month. And the Rogan podcast got 6 million views by now. And and there are lots of things happening every day for me. But the one thing that bothered me was I was in a podcast in Florida a couple of weeks ago, and I started getting hundreds of emails from fans who told me that there is a YouTube channel that shows videos with me saying things that an AI generated a creator put in my mouth, and I found that completely inappropriate for fake content to be placed in a public place. And some, of course, of my fans initially believed it. There were about 1 million views within a couple of weeks, and even a news reporter,
Wow.
featured one of the videos as evidence for what I'm saying about 3I Atlas, this interstellar object. So I decided to first of all, put it on an essay on Medium, and then write to YouTube, and gladly one of the fans gave me the right link, and they responded from YouTube and asked me, what is the issue really with your privacy? And I explained that, this is fake content impersonating me, and it creates the impression that I'm saying those things, and this is inappropriate. And I also explained that I'm consulting with legal advisors at Harvard University about the matter, and that there is a futurism news article about it already. And NBC News asked me that evening to speak with them about it. And I told them the story will get bigger unless you remove it. And so within an hour, this channel was removed. And actually, NBC News featured a statement made by YouTube. So that shows their willingness to address this matter, which I think will become a big challenge in the future, because right now you can still tell that the video is not perfect. In a year or two, the AI video produced videos will look very realistic. In my case, the clock behind me was not moving, so that was one mistake they made. Also, I decided to wear a different tie after I heard about it. So anything you see with a red tie, stating that it was recorded recently is fake, because I'm using a blue tie now. And if they change that, I will change my tie again. The point is, it's a big challenge in the future to decide how to authenticate content that we find online, including video and audio, definitely.
You and I met for the first time, really, when Branson had just come back from space, and we met at Necker Island, which was amazing. Unfortunately, you had lost your luggage.
Well, it was fortunate, Charlie, I should say, because I had to wear a T-shirt that was provided by the local, people who serve the island. And then at dinner, I didn't tell you that, but one of the attendees asked me to remove the dishes from the table, because they thought that I'm one of the servers. So I actually thought that's a great compliment, to be regarded as a member of the crew of Richard Branson, and I was willing to stay there and continue to work there.
That would have been exciting. But can you sum up, what do you really believe? I mean, since you were a kid, you were interested in space, and to be the head of astronomy at Harvard, and obviously getting all this publicity because you have a different way of seeing things. What is your core belief? And I know, when you and I met and you presented on Necker, you said, like, there's like a million galaxies. It's kind of, to think that we're the only Earth and only like species of millions is a little conceited, a little odd.
Well, it's arrogant, but much more than a million, by the way. To answer, this is an excellent question. To answer it, I need to do it at several levels. First, I'm not any different than I was as a kid. I grew up on a farm, and I was curious about nature, and I see science as the privilege to pursue your childhood curiosity. And in the process of doing that, we can make mistakes. It's a learning experience. And my way of looking at science is that the foundation of science is the humility to learn. It's not the arrogance of expertise. And what you see from most scientists, and that appear in press conferences and basically tell the public what the public should know, is the arrogance of expertise. And sometimes they have to track back what they said because it's wrong. We know that on many occasions, including during COVID, including whether to drink red wine, lots of other issues were retracted by scientists. And so science should be viewed as work in progress. And the other aspect of it is we should pay attention to what the public is interested in, because science is funded by taxpayers' money. Now, what happens right now, just to give you an example in the context of what we are speaking about, is that the mainstream of astronomers, summarized in the decadal survey of 2020, that the highest priority is to find evidence for microbes. And we should spend more than $10 billion in the next 2 decades to search for the chemical fingerprints of microbes on other planets. And that's in the form of oxygen, methane, all kinds of gases that we might find in the atmospheres of exoplanets far away. that would indicate that it may have been produced by microbes. And I say may because the same molecules can be produced by geological processes. So just imagine that you have a lot of houses on your street. In the case of the Milky Way galaxy, there are 100 billion stars like the sun, and about 10% of them have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly the same separation. So imagine 10 billion houses similar to yours on the street. Now, of course, you know that there are lots of microbes in your home, and therefore there should be also in these houses on the street. So to find them is the real challenge, because if you want to use the vantage point of the window of your home, you really need very sophisticated instruments to find microbes in your neighbor's house. And that's why it costs more than $10 billion. However, if there is one resident on your street, an intelligent resident, then that resident might show up at your front door, or you might see a tennis ball that was thrown by that resident in your backyard, or you might see a construction project in their backyard. So it might be easier, even if there is one instead of billions of microbes, to see that one resident. So I'm saying let's hedge our bets and invest billions of dollars also in the search for technological signatures. And that's not a popular view. And the way I interpret that is that common sense is not common in academia. And in fact, today I wrote an essay on medium.com. I get more than 5 million readers for my essays per month. And the one today was about how, when I started, in 1987, I started doing astrophysics. My mentor then, John Bacall at Princeton, he said to me, he asked me, what kind of computer codes did you develop so far in your PhD? And I said very humbly, I'm not really using much the computer because, only when I need to solve a set of equations that doesn't have an analytic solution, I use it. And he said, well, how do you expect to have a successful career in science without developing computer codes? And that was 1987. I did have a successful career in science. And the only reason I had that without developing computer codes is because I'm thinking differently than other scientists. So very often I have a lot of ideas bubbling in my head. And so I have young students, postdocs, faculty come to my office, and they're telling me about the problems that they're addressing. And, within seconds, I ask them a question, did you think about this idea? And they tell me, oh, no, that's an interesting idea. And then they, they look into that. They never heard about it before. And then they spend years just working on that idea. And I just fail to understand why it's not obvious to them that they should have done it and why other people didn't think about it. But that's sort of my blessing, that it appears that I think differently. And, and just yesterday I had 2 people come to my office, tell me about what they're doing. And I immediately came up with ideas that they never thought about, and we are working on related projects.
And what I liked about the article also is you said over a 30-year career, every year you'd have like 8 PhD students that you were giving ideas and they're researching this stuff. And if you multiply that by 30 years, that's a lot of things that you've been in charge of.
I've written more than 1,000 scientific papers. Now, you might think that will be remembered, but in fact, just as in life, people remember the things that require the most amount of work. So if I give an idea to someone and they then allocate years of research to bring it to maturity, they often forget, the few seconds that brought them to this idea that I suggested it to them. They forget about that, and they give most of the emphasis to the work that was done later. And it's just like I make the comparison with people. It takes much more work to bring up a kid, than it takes to conceive a baby, and it's much less pleasurable, of course. And so people tend to remember the amount of work needed to bring human beings to maturity more than the amount of work needed to come up with the baby. The same is true about ideas. So I don't get as much credit as you might think. People don't remember where the idea came from very often. Once they start working on it, they take ownership and they say, okay, well, he suggested the idea, but I actually brought it to fruition. But this is my strength, and there are numerous people and projects that came out of me telling people what might be interesting to pursue. And because of that, I'm not afraid of an idea not being popular, because I realize that things that are popular right now, when I started them, they were not popular at all. In fact, nobody thought about them. And then it became obvious that they need to be pursued. And so in the context of searching for, a neighbor or technological signature, to me, it's the most consequential question that a scientist can work on, because it will have huge implications for humanity. We just cannot ignore it the way it's ignored right now within the mainstream of science.
One of the greatest scientific books ever written was by Thomas Kuhn, who also was at Harvard, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And the book is real, and he coined the term paradigm shift, where you have academics and they write their papers and their books, and they're very not conservative. But then once they become famous, now they do everything to protect their theory, when in fact, science is about, here's my hypothesis and go ahead and attack it. And if you blow it up, then I'll change my mind because you'll prove it. And you're constant, you would think the head of astronomy, former head of astronomy at Harvard, you'd like be calcified in your thoughts, but you're totally opposite. You're coming up with new ideas all the time.
I should explain that I became chair of the astronomy department just in order to improve my academic environment, and just to bring excellent people to promote actually innovative thinking among students, postdocs, and faculty. And I saw that as a service. It was a sacrifice as far as I'm concerned, because it took away from my creative time for creative work or projects. So I did it just as a service. And as soon as I finished 3 terms, which was unprecedented, I served 9 years in that role. As soon as it was over, I came back. I bounced back to creative work, which is the most fun for me to do. Tenure in academia is supposed to relieve you from the concern about job security. And instead, what happens is once people get tenure in academia, they become attached to their ego, and they build echo chambers where they train students and postdocs to repeat their mantras so that their voice will be heard louder. And so the incentive is more ego related than innovation related. And many people just don't have the imagination to come up with new ideas, or they stick to what is already known and just perfect whatever was done, or just do some nuances of it and train students to do the same. Problematic is this aggressive pushback against any out-of-the-box thinking, any innovation that deviates from the beaten path. And you see those zealots that really attack me personally just for discussing, the possibility of a technological origin of an interstellar object. So I'll give you one example. There is this interstellar object 3I Atlas, the third one that was discovered on July 1st, 2025, by a telescope in Chile called the Atlas. And as soon as it was discovered, I immediately, within a couple of days, wrote a paper that was during a vacation that I had with my wife, because it was the 4th of July and I had some obligations, but nevertheless I took time off and wrote this paper in which I said that the object is very bright, and if you assume that its brightness stems from a reflection from a solid body, then the object must be as big as Manhattan Island, 20 kilometers in size. And that is really difficult to understand because there isn't enough rocky material in interstellar space to deliver such a huge package to our backyard once per decade. The survey went for a decade. And Instead, I said, well, if the object is that big, then it cannot, it's more likely targeting the inner solar system. That was my concluding sentence. And the editor of the journal said, I will accept it for publication as long as you remove that sentence. He didn't want any mention of a possibility that it might be technological. And just to let you know, this editor, his name is Chris Lintott. He worked on SETI, the search for radio signals. So anyway, he didn't want it to be discussed. I removed it, and then the week after that, I decided to write a full scientific paper on the technological origin, a paper that was submitted to a different journal and was accepted for publication after peer review. And so the editor went out to the New York Post and said that this is nonsense on stilts, a phrase borrowed from Bentham. And he was a student at University College London, so perhaps he heard it there. He said, considering a technological origin for this object is nonsense on stilts. And what I find really strange is that this same guy says nothing like, over this past week, there were 2 experiments reporting results in Nature magazine, the most prestigious journal, about a search for a ghost particle, sterile neutrino, that was suspected to exist just because of some anomalies in previous experiments. And they invested altogether $90 million in searching for this ghost particle and didn't find it. So wouldn't you say this was nonsense on stilts? Because we now know that this particle doesn't exist. So it's nonsense because this particle doesn't exist. So why wouldn't the same Chris Lintott have a problem with scientists working for a decade on 2 experiments that cost $90 million and were nonsense because this particle doesn't exist? He said nothing about that. However, when the object 3 Atlas was just discovered and we didn't have any information about its nature, at that time, just having one sentence at the end of a full paper was, to him, a heresy. And you ask yourself, have we evolved since the time that the Vatican put Galileo in house arrest? Have we really evolved? And what happened to the Vatican? It was the worst public fiasco, because in 1992 they admitted that Galileo was right, and that was 350 years after he died. Okay, so it really would beg any intelligent person to, the experience from the past would say, you shouldn't really put any censorship on a single sentence at the end of a paper just because you don't like that conclusion. There's so many examples that I can give of revolutions in science that were completely ridiculed, including Einstein's theory. Yeah, in the case of Einstein, there was a book, by the way, which was partly driven by anti-Semitism, and the book title was 100 Scientists Against the Theory of Relativity. So Einstein was asked about it, and he said, why would it matter what 100 scientists say? What matters is what the physical reality is, and so far his theory agrees with all the data that we have. And it's not, it's not like social media where the number of likes you get matters for you. It really is irrelevant. And the question of whether we have a neighbor or not will not depend on whether at the dinner table we tell our family members that we don't have a neighbor. It's completely irrelevant what you tell your family member. Your neighbor would still be there, for the same reason that the Earth moved around the sun 4.6 billion times before the Vatican even existed. So the Vatican saying something didn't change the orbit of the Earth. It's ridiculous of people in the modern time to insist on narratives. And I should say also that this was the 3rd interstellar object. So you cannot be an expert on objects entering the solar system from outside because there were only 2 that were identified before that. So when you have a sample of 2 and the 3rd one shows up some anomalies, you can't justify any mainstream orthodoxy based on that.
And Avi, how many scientists, astronomers at your level with your type of credentials globally are aligned with your thinking?
Not many. I have collaborators, people who work with me on papers, but many of them are reluctant to express publicly the support because they're worried about being attacked. And obviously, that's the reason that these attacks take place, because it's one way to keep the herd of all scientists in a tight configuration. And of course, it has a damaging impact on innovation, because young people that are usually more innovative, they're afraid to deviate, to think outside the box because of job prospects. If the senior people attack them, then they lose any opportunity for getting a permanent position somewhere, and that is really the problem. And you might ask, why is it that a century ago there were so many discoveries and that were disruptive? For example, quantum mechanics was completely unanticipated. And I was in Copenhagen just at the end a few months ago for a conference at the Niels Bohr Institute. And I went into the
Right.
auditorium, and I immediately, I mean, everything was familiar to me because there is a famous photograph of that auditorium with the pioneers of quantum mechanics attending a conference there 95 years ago. And I sat on a wooden bench there, and someone said to me, "Oh, you're sitting in exactly the place where Wolfgang Pauli sat 95 years ago." And then the only thing I could think of was how uncomfortable was this bench, because back then, the quality of life was not so great. But I would trade everything to go back 95 years and sit there in the company of people who were willing to change our perception of the physical reality. Niels Bohr argued that quantum mechanics is a completely new way of thinking about reality. Einstein didn't like that, and he insisted that there must be something missing, that in fact, quantum mechanics cannot have spooky action at a distance. And he was wrong. Niels Bohr was right, because he was daring to think differently. But back then, I think people were far more open-minded. The community was smaller, and the people were much more open to innovation than they are now. Now the community is much bigger, and as you know, there is when you have large numbers, there is regression to the mean. That's why I don't like big committees. When you have a large enough committee, then there is regression to the mean. Everyone converges on the average opinion, which is not necessarily the correct one.
Yeah, and I think you're a very unusual person. I tell my kids that your mind is like a parachute. It only works if it's open. And I find people in academia where you should be open or not. And I'm trying to figure out where this came from. You talked about your grandfather was one of only 66 family members to escape Nazi Germany alive. How did the echoes of the Holocaust that you describe in your books and Israel's war for survival during your childhood influence your sense of urgency about humanity's future and the importance of reaching beyond the earth?
Well, if you look at what happens on Earth right now, and it's not just limited to the Middle East, but most of our attention is to conflicts over territories, and uh, these are pieces of land on the surface of a rock, which is just a little bit of debris left over from the formation of the sun. Okay, so the Earth is tiny. It's 3 parts in a million of the mass of the sun. Tiny bit that was left behind and coagulated into a planet, and we assign a huge importance. I mean, when I say we, I mean, for example, Putin. Like to a small piece of land, and he
Right.
puts a lot of people on basically on a death row. Yeah, just think about it. It's a small sliver of land. Now, most of my point is simple. Most of the real estate is actually out there in space, because, as I said, there are maybe 10 billion Earth-like planets out there just in the Milky Way galaxy, and altogether 1 trillion galaxies like it in the observable volume of the universe, and many more beyond the observable volume of the universe. We know that the conditions that we find in the observable volume continue at least 4,000 times farther. So there is just a huge number of similar systems with much more real estate than we have. And for some reason, we are just obsessed with a piece of land on this rock. And, it might not be for very long, because humanity might not survive for many centuries into the future, given what we do, how much damage we can cause to this planet, to ourselves. And so it's really very short-sighted, the way we think about things. And how can this change? I'm not that naive to think that politicians one day will wake up and say, well, you know what? We are all in the same boat. Let's cooperate. It will not happen. So the one trigger that can bring us to a better state is if we find alien technology, somewhere near us, which would alert us to two things. First, we have a sibling in our family of intelligent civilizations within the Milky Way galaxy. There is another one, at least. And moreover, this sibling arrived to our backyard before we arrived to their backyard. So they are more accomplished than we are. Maybe they had a time advantage. They started billions of years ago, before the sun was born. Perhaps that's the reason they're here. But at any event, there is a role model from whom we can learn something. We can be inspired. And right now we're investing 2.4 trillion dollars in military budgets. About $1 trillion is assigned to the defense budget of the US in 2026. So that's a lot of money. And if we realize that alien technology is entering the solar system, I think it will bring us to a sense of planetary defense, a defense of the planet from outside. And then perhaps we will allocate a fraction of these $2.4 trillion to space exploration. So my hope is, let's say $1 trillion a year will go into construction of a network, an array of sensors and interceptors that, whenever there is an incoming object from outside the solar system, we would take a close-up photograph of it and decide what to do about it if it's not just a rock. And a technological object is much more dangerous than a rock, because a rock has a prescribed path that we can deflect in principle, but a technological object could maneuver, it could have an intent, and that's far more dangerous. So if we invest $1 trillion a year on this infrastructure in space, first of all, it changes the geopolitics of the planet, because we are now working together. And moreover, just think about what we might discover with $1 trillion a year in space exploration. I had a podcast, I have many, but one of them was a couple of weeks ago with Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House. I was really surprised because he started it. I'm not sure if it was in the recording, but he said, Avi, it's a great honor to speak with you. I really wanted to thank you for bringing space to the attention of the public in a way that was far more effective just over the past few months, far more effective than was done ever before. And I found that to be really a surprise for me, that because I've never spoken with him. So the way it will enter into politics is, of course, after the first encounter with alien technology. I'm not expecting it to happen before, but I do think that as long as we survive the first encounter, then it will change everything. It will change politics. It will change the financial markets, because people will not have the same sense of security, safety they have right now. And it will change, obviously, philosophy, religion, the way we think about ourselves in the context of the universe.
Yeah. And, you frequently quote Sherlock Holmes' line, there's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. Why is that?
Comet experts behave just like AI systems. They are basing their assertions on the training data set that they had over the decades, which is icy rocks in space. And my point is really simple. I'm saying, you need to expand your training data set, because we know that we launched technological equipment to space, so there aren't only rocks out there. And it's quite likely that there were others that did the same in the Milky Way galaxy, because there are so many Earth-Sun analogs out there. So we should just allow for the possibility that some of the objects entering the solar system will not be just rocks. They might target the inner solar system. And we should examine if, anomalies that suggest that maybe an object is not behaving just as we expected for a rock. rather than dismissing that possibility. What these comet experts are missing when they talk about an obvious interpretation is that, when they say obvious, they probably mean 98%, 95%, whatever. This is okay in the context of, a star exploding at the edge of the universe. You can say at the 95% confidence, I think it's this mechanism triggering it. Because if you're wrong, it doesn't affect anything, here on Earth. Who cares?
And does it frustrate you? I mean, you have the NASA, I think he was the associate director that came out and said, this object is a comet, looks like a comet, behaves like a comet, and all the evidence suggests it's a comet. I mean, it's like you probably want to kill him.
These were NASA officials at a press conference, and they made the mistake of, you know,
Right.
not bringing scientists to the conversation that would, that analyze the data and would talk about. They didn't talk about anomalies. They just wanted to deliver a narrative. And this is not the way science is done. As I said before, it's not the arrogance of expertise, not telling the public what this, but raising questions and showing that more data will actually resolve these questions. And there are definitely, I listed 13 anomalies that about 3A Atlas, and they didn't mention any of them except one that they even dismissed, which was that this object shed mostly nickel with very little iron, not even detectable, and that we don't find in any other astronomical object. Usually, iron and nickel come together, except for the technological production of nickel alloys, where the iron is separated out. And the astronomers that wrote these papers reporting about nickel without iron, they said that, maybe the same process that we use in our industries, which is the carbonyl pathway, is also happening in nature. That was their explanation. And I say, well, maybe it's a technological signature. Why not consider that? Because that's the only place where we find nickel without iron. So the fact that NASA officials showed up and they presented fuzzy images, really, they tried to tamper down any excitement about this object. This is not the way that science should be done. It should be like the work of a detective. You talk specifically about things that are unusual and how you either explain them, or if you can't explain them, how you plan to explain them. This is the way science is done, because what do you expect from a spacecraft? If you, what is the definition of a comet? That it sheds some gas or dust from its surface as a result of being illuminated by the sun, and we see some cometary tail, because this dust and gas are pushed away from the sun, and you see a tail behind the object. That's how a comet is defined. And but imagine a spacecraft going through
Right.
some dense environment in interstellar space and accumulating on its surface some ice because it's freezing out there, and accumulating on its surface some dust, collecting it along the path. Then when it comes close to the sun, it will shed those materials. So you would say it's a comet, but don't judge a book by its cover if it's only the outer skin. That you can't say that until you actually know what the content of this object is. I mean, we know about the Trojan horse tail, when it was clear
Yeah.
that this is not very suspicious, but it ended up changing the future of the city of Troy. So we just need to be careful. It's a very superficial assessment as to something being a comet, walks like a comet. What does she mean by walks like a comet? She means it responds to gravity. Okay, so any object responds to gravity. There was actually some evidence for non-gravitational acceleration of 3A Atlas, which was not even mentioned or discussed in this press conference. So the public really was frustrated by this press conference. It didn't serve any good purpose. The actually good data came a couple of weeks later from the Hubble telescope, a very good image of 3A Atlas, which indicated that there is a jet coming from it in the direction of the sun. And this is an anti-tail. In other words, we don't see evidence for a tail in the Hubble image. Instead, we see an extension towards the sun, not away
Right.
from the sun. And that was true also in July. On July 21st, Hubble observed it first. When it was approaching the sun, we saw an extension, a jet pointed towards the sun, nothing going backwards, away from the sun. Then, most recently, at the end of November 30th, there was another image after the object passed closest to the sun on October 29th. And now, still there is an extension of the glow around the object towards the sun. So relative to the direction of motion, it's now opposite, and it's an anti-tail in both cases when it was approaching and receding. So clearly there is something we don't understand. I wrote 3 papers trying to explain it. The NASA officials did not even refer to that.
Yeah. In a week, December 19, it's going to be when it's
Right.
closest to the Earth. What do you think might happen, or will we get better images that will help prove what you've been saying?
More data, the better. I mean, I would still give most odds to the likelihood that it's actually a natural object, but it has anomalies that make it unique and unusual. But December 19th is really a good date to observe it, because it will be a new moon, so there won't be much moonlight contaminating the sky. And my hope is that hundreds of observatories around the Earth will look at it, also the Webb telescope and potentially the Hubble telescope. So we will get a lot of data. It will take a few weeks for the data to come out, so we will not know immediately. But my wish is that we will get some spectroscopic data that would give us the speed of the gas in the jets. We see multiple jets coming from the object, the nucleus of the object, in different directions. And I would like to know if the speed of the gas is a few hundred meters per second or lower than that, which would be consistent with the sublimation of pockets of ice on the surface of a rock by sunlight illuminating or warming these pockets of ice, compared to technological thrusters, which usually eject gas at a much larger speed of a few kilometers per second for chemical propellants, or a few tens of kilometers per second for ion thrusters. And so if we see a high speed, that would be indicative of technology. If we see a low speed of less than a few hundred meters per second, then maybe it's natural. That would be my first priority in terms of what I want to know. And the second is the composition of those jets and how much mass is flowing through them. If it turns out that a significant fraction of the object is coming out in these jets, and we see that they move at slow speeds and they are made primarily of carbon dioxide ice vapor, or water ice vapor, or carbon monoxide ice vapor, then I would say it's probably a natural object. In July, I defined a scale that is now called the Loeb classification scale, where 0 means a natural object, 10 means a technological object, potentially a threat to humanity. And I will be able to rank this object. I started with a rank of 4 when it was just discovered, and now I'm waiting for this new data to refine my assessment.